Hello, this is Chuck Ridgway, Automation Technology Manager at Horner. Thanks for joining us for another Tuesday live stream. Today's topic is using the Cscape Menu Object. Now, I'm going to be flying solo today. We had some technical difficulties getting headquarters connected to my studio, so it's just going to be me. You'll have to put up with me. Casey is standing by, though, manning the chat. Well, let's talk about today's topic a little bit. The menu object. I think a lot of us have multiple consumer electronics items which utilize a menu-based user interface. Things like our big screen televisions for going in and making adjustments to that. Other type consumer devices, very common for a menu user interface to be implemented. Now, I first remember utilizing menu user interfaces way back in the early days of the Apple iPod, when it was still this small device with a tiny monochrome screen and a little click wheel type thing. But because of the click wheel and because of the menu hierarchy on the device, you could very quickly find the information you needed without a lot of difficulty. And that's really one of the advantages of the menu object with the Horner OCS is you can find the information you need quickly, even if you have a small screen. Okay, so once again, if you're watching this live, don't hesitate to chat in your questions. We're standing by to get those answered right away. And if you're watching it on replay, give us your questions in the comment section. We'll get those answered in non-real time. All right, let's dive right in. Okay, here's how we're breaking down today's topic, and that is, again, using the Cscape Menu Object. We're going to go through what is the menu object, when is it useful. We're going to talk about the different options you have with the menu object. We're going to show you how to set it up in Cscape. We're going to show you how to use it at runtime, and of course, we'll have demonstrations all throughout. All right, let's get right to it. All right, so what is the Cscape Menu Object? Well, it is a graphical object available in the Cscape graphics editor. For those of you who've worked with OCS regularly, you know that all the user interface configuration, including all the graphics development, is done in the Cscape graphics editor. And you have a number of objects that are available to you to utilize as you design your user interface. And the Cscape Menu Object is one of those, and it's actually one of the most comprehensive graphical objects available because it provides you with everything you need to design in and fully implement a menu structure. Now, in some applications, the menu structure is extremely effective. Not in every application, but in a lot of them it is. So we're going to show you how to add that to your OCS toolbox with the menu object. So when is the menu object most useful? Well, certainly in applications when you've got a large amount of data to be displayed, or maybe a large number of parameters that need to be set in the machine. So there's a lot to wade through from a user perspective, and it's especially useful in those applications where that is true and you've got a relatively small screen. Maybe an XLE or an XLT, maybe one of our micro OCS X4s or the X5s. They can be useful on larger screened units as well, but the smaller the screen, the more critical the menu object can be to your application. So what can you actually do with the menu object? Well, you can effectively create a hierarchical menu structure with a series of menus and submenus to lead your user through the data or through the parameters that they need to operate the machine. The different items you can have in your menu include things like static text. You can set up submenus that they can navigate through. You can display real-time data, which is either just read-only or editable. You can do screen jumps to help with screen navigation. There's just a lot you can do with the menu object. Now, once again, let's talk about the menu object in terms of how we set it up in Cscape. So yes, it's accessible from the Cscape graphics editor. You're going to look in the icon toolbar. You're going to look for the menu object icon, and I've got it highlighted there. Once you have clicked on that, you're going to click within the screen area of your editor and drag that window to size. Now, the menu object always works best when it's full screen. In other words, when it's the only object on the screen, that's the optimum way to utilize the menu object. So after you've kind of sized it a little bit on your screen, go ahead and take the handles on each side and just stretch it to full screen. almost all the time, that's the way you're going to want to use it. Now, you're going to double click on that menu object that's now full screen, and you're going to come up with the main dialog box here. And let's start by focusing on a couple of items in the upper left-hand corner of this dialog. The first one is called Exclusive Focus. What's that all about? Well, when this object is the only object on the screen, you're going to want to check Exclusive Focus. What that means is that as soon as the user navigates to the screen that contains the menu object, it's already going to be active and ready to use. There's nothing the user's going to have to do to make it active. With a typical object which has an action to it, let's think about a touchscreen scenario. With a typical object that has an action to it, the first thing the user usually has to do is touch that object for it to even be active or to have focus. So with the menu object, and especially when we're using it on screens like the XLE and XLT that are key-based or just small screened in general, having that exclusive focus already established makes it easier on the user. Now there's another option in the upper left-hand corner, and that is that the selection bar can either be full length or non-full length. Now almost all the time you're going to want that selection bar to be full length. Let me show you what I mean here. If you take a look at this real-world application of this XLE with a menu screen being displayed, you can see that the I/O status menu item is fully highlighted, okay, all the way from left to right. So that's because it was created with the select full length option checked. Now the next thing we want to take a look at is the option to have a submenu selection register or a submenu selection variable. What would that be used for? Now first of all, it's optional. You don't need to use that. Effectively, it's going to be a variable which is going to contain a numerical value which can be an indicator of where the user is in the menu navigation. Now if you write to that register, you can even automatically cause navigation to a specific location in the menu. Now that's an advanced feature. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for most applications. As a matter of fact, the application I'm showing you, which is going to be pretty typical in a lot of ways, doesn't utilize that register at all. Now if you do utilize that register, remember you're going to want to initialize it to a value of 0 so that when the user starts off at the menu, that they're starting off at the highest level. Whereas if you leave it with a non-zero value, they're going to start out somewhere in the depths of the system menu, okay, or of their custom menu that they've created. So again, most cases you don't need to utilize that feature, but it's there as an advanced feature. Now once you've set those few parameters, then you're pretty much ready to go. And then the majority of the task is going to be spent configuring your menu pages, and you do that by pressing the button in the upper right hand corner, and then you just start adding items to your main menu. So we're looking at the main page, the main menu page dialog here. Now you start off with a blank slate, and you just need to hit the add button to start adding items to your menu. Okay, and there's a variety of items you can add, and they're shown here on the screen. You can add a submenu page pointer. You can add a numeric data field, an ASCII data field, a text table. You can display time and date on an item as a menu. You can display a password data field on the menu, and you can do a screen jump selection on the menu as well. So these are all the things that are available as items on your menu. Okay, now let's start with a very common one, a very common item for you to put on your main menu, and that would be a submenu page. So in other words, you're putting an item on your main menu that's going to allow the user to select it and navigate to a submenu. So when you add that to your main menu, you just need to provide a name under the prompt text field and decide whether you want it left justified, center justified, or right justified. And most of the time with menus, you're going to do everything left justified when it comes to your prompting text. Now again, when the user selects this at runtime, he's effectively going to navigate to this submenu. But the actual configuration of the submenu in Cscape, we'll do that in a later step, and I'll show you that. Okay, so adding a submenu is one thing we can add to our main menu. Another thing we can add that's very useful is a numeric data item. You just need to configure the prompting text, which is kind of like the legend that you would have on an individual data item that is not part of the menu object. But basically, you're going to put your descriptive text under prompt text, and then you're going to select the type of data field and where it's referenced to, which variable, which register, by filling in the attributes field. Now, there's one thing that you have to do in the menu object from a numeric standpoint that you don't have to do in a traditional numeric object, and that is under the minimum limit and maximum limit, you have to make sure that that is filled in appropriately for your data field, because whether it's read-only or read-write, that has to be filled in. Whereas with a traditional numeric data field, that only really applies to an editable data field. Okay, so whether it's editable or not, make sure that the minimum limit and the maximum limit are set the way you want them. And notice again that you have your choice between an editable data field or a non-editable data field. Now, a non-editable data field will be displayed on your menu list, but it won't be selectable. So when a user moves down through the choices, they'll see that on the list, but they won't be able to select it because it's really just there to display data and read-only data at that. Whereas with a read-write data field, they'll be able to select that and then go in and edit it. Another useful item for a menu object is a text table item. So this is really just another type of numeric data object, but just one in which you're going to show the results with a text string instead of a numeric value. So on, off, hand off, auto, etc., hot, cold, etc. Just like a text table you would use as a separate object, text table is also available to be an item on the menu object. Screen jump, that one can be very useful as well, no question about that. So with a screen jump item, when the operator selects that at runtime, then effectively they will jump to the screen that is indicated when you configured it. Now, if you want them to be able to navigate back to the menu with pressing the escape key, then you just make sure that the allow escape to return option is checked. Okay, and that will jump back into the menu when they press escape when they want to leave that screen that they jump to. Now, one thing to note, and that is as of current firmware, from when we taped or when we broadcast live this particular session, the escape action, instead of escaping back into the menu from which the jump occurred, it's going to jump back to the top level of the menu. So that's not exactly the way we'd like it to be. So we've got a Mantis item, which is our bug tracking software. We've got one of those created, and it's something we'll get addressed. But just keep in mind that when your user escapes from that screen, they're going to go back to the top level of the menu. And that really only applies to you if you've got multiple levels in your menu. Okay, and the last one I'm going to talk about with any specifics is the no entry item. This is really just a convenient way to put some text as an item on the screen. It can't be selected, but it's there, and it could be informational. It could be a little bit of help information. It could be a little bit of extra legend type space for a nearby numeric data field. There's a variety of things you could use this no entry item for. Okay, so now that we have created our main menu, and as part of that main menu creation, it's very possible that we have submenu items that are on our main menu. So how do we configure those submenus? Well, once you add items to your main menu that are submenus, you'll see that on the left side of the dialog, what we call the hierarchy pane, you'll see those submenus show up in a tree structure where they can later be selected and edited. The other way that you can select and edit a submenu is by selecting the item on the list for the main menu list and then hitting the expand submenu button. But anyway, the easiest way really is just click directly on it in the hierarchy pane. Next, let's talk about a couple other things, a couple other options that are available in the dialog box for configuration. The first thing we're going to talk about is this enabler register or enables register. What's that all about? Well, it's another advanced feature. Again, it's optional, where you have a 32-bit variable you can assign which effectively has 1 bit allocated to each item on your menu or submenu. So you could have, let's say, as many as 32 items on your menu or submenu, and each of those items from top to bottom is going to correlate with one of the bits in the enables register. And if you are using the enables register, it means that you want to, on the fly, remove items or hide items on the list. Okay, so why would you ever want to do that? Well, maybe you have a user that it doesn't have authorization, so you want to hide some of the options from them. There are a variety of reasons you might want to do that. Now, in most applications, again, it's an advanced feature. In most applications, you're just going to leave that empty and not worry about that. Because if you do choose to use the enables register, then you do have to make sure that each bit is on for each menu item that you want to have enabled or that you want to show in the system. Now let's go ahead and fire up Cscape, and I'm going to show you how to set up your menu object. All right, so for those of you who weren't with us last week we demonstrated an application that we created that allows an XLE to act as a remote I/O block off of Ethernet IP. And we did this because there's a lot of difficulty these days in finding Ethernet IP I/O blocks because of supply chain issues. So we showed you how to use an XLE for that. And XLEs are currently available because of the hard work of our production team and our sourcing team. But anyway, as part of that application, there was a user interface design that was part of that so that the user could set up the I/O block and also monitor the status of any of the I/O. And we utilized basically just multiple screens with jump commands to navigate from screen to screen. This week, I thought it would be interesting to take a similar application, again, an application for using the XLE as remote I/O block, but to base the user interface on a menu object and see the differences there, or at least to illustrate how you could use a menu object for that task. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive right into that. I'm going to go ahead and fire up the graphics editor in Cscape, and you can see here I've got my XLE, and this week I only have 2 screens configured. One screen with a comprehensive menu object, another screen that happens to be a screen that we can use to set up the Ethernet parameters for the XLE as a remote I/O block. But let's start with the menu object screen. Okay, so I'm going to click here and illustrate that this is a menu object that was placed on the screen. It was stretched to full screen so that it occupies the entire screen. I'm going to double click on it here and illustrate the fact that yes, we chose exclusive focus, which is important in this scenario. That way the object is up and running and ready to go as soon as the user sees it. He doesn't have to do anything to enable the object, if you will, or to bring focus to the object. We also checked select full length. Now, this is where we can configure the color scheme of both the header as well as the items in the menu object. Let me bring up real quick the real world representation of this. And you can see at the top, the header is the XLE Model 6 I/O there at the top, and then the menu items are listed below the solid line there. Now, for a monochrome OCS, we have to select the same color scheme for both the header as well as the items. For a color OCS, we can set these independently if necessary. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the Configure Menu Pages option here and take a look at what we configured for our main menu. So on our main menu, we added 4 items to that list. It started out as blank, and we added 4 items. The first item we added was a text table item. What was that for? Well, it was to give the operator the ability to see at a glance if the system was okay or not. And if the system is okay, then effectively they will see yes. If the system is not okay, they'll see no. Okay, and here on the text table item, we've just had to configure the register or variable that data or text table item is tied to, how many ASCII digits we want to display. In this case, the longest thing we need to display is yes, which is 3 digits. And we had to make sure we have a text table selected. And again, in this case, it's text table number 1 that's either going to show no for 0 and yes 1. Okay, so that's just a text table object, or item I should say, placed at the top of my main menu. Next, I have an option for the user to select an IO status submenu. Okay, and in that configuration, literally all we have to configure is the name for that as well as the justification. Again, the details on that specific submenu will be configured elsewhere, and we'll show that to you in a minute. All right, after that item on my main menu, I have a screen jump for going to the Ethernet setup screen. Okay, so I selected screen jump there, and then it's really just a matter of selecting the screen number like any other jump command and checking the allow escape to return if we do indeed want the user to come back to the menu system when they're done with that screen by pressing escape. All right, and then finally we have another submenu, which is my Ethernet status submenu. Okay, so that's my main menu. Those are the items there. Now, because I have a couple of submenus, all right, my submenus show up as the next level below my main menu. Okay, so I've got my IO status menu and my Ethernet status menu. So the easiest way for me to configure those is just to click on them here, and then the IO status menu is brought up here. Okay, and in this case, each of these items is a pointer to yet another submenu for looking at the status for each of my different types of I/O: digital in, digital out, analog in, analog out, and high-speed counter data. That was really just a matter of, for each of these items, naming and setting the justification. That's all there was to it. All right, and then because these were added as submenus, the next level down in the hierarchy is where they show up here, and I can individually go in and configure each of those. Okay, so here's my digital in submenu, and this is all a bunch of numeric data fields. So this is actually the data I want the operator to see for the status. Now, you can argue whether you like this approach for displaying data or the status of the I/O for the operator, or the approach I used last week, but it's just two different choices, two different approaches. So with this approach, what I did was I had on the first line a way for the operator to see at a glance the state of all 12 inputs, and then they can scroll down to each of the 12 individual inputs to see whether they're on or off, 0 or 1. Okay, and configuration for each of the items is basically identical, just a matter of selecting the address as well as the register width, selecting binary as the format, how many digits I want to display. In this case, I'm just displaying 1 bit on or off, and making sure my min and my max are set appropriately. Okay, so that's pretty much all there is to it there. On the digital output side, that's also identically configured. I also have 12 outputs. They can see at a glance the status of all 12 outputs at once, or they can look individually by scrolling down through the list at the individual status of each. On the analog input menu, again, all numeric data. This time though, instead of being binary information, it is signed decimal information. Now this is where it was really important that my minimum limit and maximum limit are set to appropriate values to make sure that I'm getting the data display that I wanted. Otherwise, what I could see instead would be a series of left arrows indicating my value is out of range too low, or a series of right arrows indicating that my data is out of range too high. But as long as I've set min and max appropriately, even though this is read-only, everything's going to work the way I want. And then I've set up the analog out identically here. These are all numeric data fields. High-speed counter, same thing. The only difference there with the high-speed counter is each of these data fields is a double integer with obviously much larger minimum and maximum limits. So that is what the IO status submenu looks like, or the various IO status submenus look like. Let's go to the Ethernet status submenu here. This is literally 3 items, okay, and none of them are submenus. We've got a link OK indicator, which is the text table. Again, yes or no. Is the link OK? Yes. Is the link OK? No. Is the scanner OK? Same thing. And connections, which is a numeric data field that's tied to the lower 8 bits of the Ethernet IP status register that tells us how many active connections we have with the OCS, or that the OCS has with external devices. Okay, so that's the configuration in Cscape for the menu object. So there's quite a bit of configuration to it, but as you can see, you can set up some pretty sophisticated menu systems all on one object on one particular screen. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to show you what this looks like at runtime. Okay, so let's go ahead and fire up our overhead camera. Here's our XLE, and I'll just show you the navigation here. It should be pretty straightforward. All right, so we've got our IO status menu as our first option. Now notice anything that's selectable, as I use the arrow keys to navigate up and down, anything that's selectable is highlighted as it is selected. The system OK status at the top there, yes or no, it is just a display of data. It's not selectable. If I select, let's go ahead and select the Ethernet setup, which is a jump command to another screen. Okay, I'll hit the enter to jump to that screen. Here I can go in and change the configuration if I like for the Ethernet setup parameters. This is a completely separate screen that we've jumped to. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit escape, and I'll go back to the top level of my menu here. Okay, so that was the Ethernet setup. Let's take a look at Ethernet status while we're at it. Again, there's nothing for me to navigate to here because none of these are selectable. These are all just informational displays. So I can see the status of link OK, scanner OK, and how many connections are established. I have one with an Ethernet IP scanner, and I have another with Cscape. That's why we're seeing two connections here. I'll back up by hitting escape. And now let's go take a look at these at the IO status menu. Okay, this is where we now have our choice of all the different types of IO. We'll start with the digital inputs. As those digital inputs are manipulated, you'll see the status change here. Because there's so many IO points, we can continue to scroll down as we go well below the lower limits of the screen as we continue to scroll down in this particular object, and you can see everything changing. I can back up. The digital output works similarly, as you can see here. I can scroll through all the different IO statuses there. On the analog input side, I can see the current value of the two analog inputs that I actually have connected. Okay, 3 and 4 are open circuit. That's why they have values of -6400. And then on the analog output side, I believe there's only one coming over from Ethernet IP, and the others are just fixed at 0. And then finally, we do have our high-speed counter option, which shows us the current count on our high-speed counter. Okay, so that is a menu-driven user interface based on the Cscape graphical menu object. So that pretty much wraps up the material that I wanted to cover with you today. Once again, as we wrap up here, I want to remind you that every Tuesday we're here at 2 o'clock with another live session. Even on the weeks when we aren't completely live, we'll be live streaming the content that was pre-recorded and standing by live to answer your questions if you have any in the chat section. And of course, you can always watch any of our videos on replay and ask your questions in the comment section. What I want to mention for next week is we think we've got a fun session for you, and that is more helpful Horner hacks. We had a helpful Horner hacks session a few weeks ago. Went over very well, and it was mostly focused on hardware related hacks. You know, ways of using some creative terminal strips or alternative terminal strips, some ways of utilizing things a little differently than normal, but it was mostly hardware related. This week we're going to be talking mostly about software type features and functions that you may not be familiar with. As an example, we're going to show you, for those of you who are interested, we're going to show you how you can have multiple versions of Cscape loaded and running on your computer, so that if you're dealing with older equipment that uses a very old version of Cscape and you're using a relatively new version of Cscape for your current developments, they can both be, you know, residing on your computer and living happily together. So that's one of the things we're going to cover next week in more helpful Horner hacks. And I do want to make a final reminder, if you haven't done so already, don't hesitate to subscribe. Of course, it doesn't cost anything. And if you choose notifications, you will be notified when we go live or when we post another video. Okay, once again, stay safe out there, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.